and welcome to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies, a podcast where our international fellows discuss the most pressing issues of today that we're all facing and share their exciting research ideas. We hope you enjoyed today's talk. Thank you for tuning in.
A few words of introduction. I'm really delighted to welcome Alison back to the Institute of Advanced Studies. After a couple of years, I think, you came a couple of years ago, and I think on this occasion, as part of her sabbatical, I think you're doing a bit of a tour and including us in that tour, which is really great. I'm not going to say too much other than how delightful it's been to be working with Alison over the last 7 or 8 years, actually. And I'm really looking forward to today because I think it was about 2 years ago, we had a really great walk around Paddington, and Alison was telling me all about the stuff she'd been doing on the names of houses over there. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what she has to say about that today and really enhance collective understanding of graphic heritage and how that area of activity is moving forward. So looking forward to it. Over to you, Alison.
Thanks, Rob. I actually decided that this is entirely the wrong talk for Loughborough. And actually, I should have talked about the work I've done around the football stadium or the soccer stadium. Well, it's both, actually. And that contested space, for Loughborough, that would be really more on brand, wouldn't it? But here we are. I only thought about that at midnight last night, at which point it was too late. Before I go any further, actually, where do I need to point that at? There?
You'll need to use the mouse if you want to.
No, just to forward it on. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I guess firstly, before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge that I guess the research that forms the basis of this talk was undertaken in unceded Gadigal land in the place that's now known as Paddington in Sydney, Australia. Obviously, it's long after the invasion took place in 1788, but I guess my position in this is complicated because I'm a white kind of settler in this space. And I guess it puts me kind of right in the middle, really, of what Aileen Morton Robinson, who's an Indigenous Australian academic, calls the ongoing project of white possession. So certainly in kind of contemporary understandings of the sort of settler colonial project, as it's not finished, it's not over, it's still kind of ongoing. So, I wanted to kind of speak to that first. But anyway, I can't make this go forward. There we go. Okay. When I moved to the second time to Sydney and to Paddington in 2021 in the middle of COVID, which was quite some undertaking, seeing as their borders were shut, but I did it. But there were quite a few restrictions in place at that time. So I think we could only walk we had a 5K radius. So everyone was doing lots of walking, as you remember we were doing here in 2019, I guess, when I started in Loughborough. So you became like really intimately familiar with your local areas. And so Paddington kind of really I hadn't lived there before, so it started to sort of introduce me to itself through my kind of local walks. And on one of those walks, I was going up Union Street and I noticed this sign on the front of somebody's front door. And obviously it's kind of traditional materials, the sort of black and gold leaf paint on the glass, and it's really cracked. There's that lovely textural effect. The letter forms are maybe I'll test the graphic designers, actually. Anyone know what those type of letter forms are called? Tuscan letter forms. So they've got these kind of little bifurcated serifs at the bottom. So they're kind of, I suppose, very prevalent in the kind of early to mid 1800s and sort of Victorian advertising context. So I suppose I first stopped because I saw it as a graphic designer and I thought, oh my God, that's so beautiful. And I guess, like many other things on a lot of the houses in Paddington, it's been preserved. But it wasn't just the kind of material quality I was drawn to, it was actually the name. So as a small child, for your pleasure, although I think it was possibly slightly older than that, but I was taken to Brixham on holiday, and I've got kind of vague memories of the harbour and the fishing boats. And so there was this weird moment where my past was kind of colliding with the present. But then it was happening in other ways as well, because I'd previously lived in London, so Paddington obviously resonated, but I'd grown up in Cambridge. So again, there was this weird thing about my personal geography. So I moved into a house on Norfolk Street when I first moved to Paddington, but I'd also lived on Norfolk Street in Cambridge. And then down the bottom from Norfolk Street, opposite, just across the road, was Cambridge Street. So there was this kind of strange sort of thing going on. And the more I kind of walked around Paddington, the more I saw house names and street names that kind of held stories, not only for me, but obviously held stories about other people, the place, about heritage, that kind of thing. But obviously that sort of narrative, particularly the street names, was kind of written as part of that settler colonial project. But its foundational language, I guess, is kind of coming at us through the material sort of form of the street and house signs, and therefore through this idea of sort of toponymy and graphic heritage. But I guess this is a story that isn't just rooted in my nice memories. It's about politics and power. And they're not stories, like I sort of intimated at the beginning, that are consigned to the past. They're kind of shaping place in the present and continue to do so. So they're kind of as relevant now as they ever were. So I guess I'm kind of focusing on two questions that run through this. So this is actually a book chapter that I'm writing, and the idea for the book actually came off my period of the fellowship last time I was here. So it's different case studies around the idea of urban graphic heritage, people, politics, and place. So the two questions in this chapter, I guess, or in this talk, are kind of, what stories do the street and house names of Paddington tell us about place, power, and heritage, and why don't we always notice these? And I think the answer to the second question about not noticing things is really rooted in design, but in actually quite diametrically opposed ways between the street signs and the house signs. And paradoxically, I think for the house signs, it's about kind of their beauty and their effect on us that they hide. So they're actually hiding in a really almost overt way that I can see. So they're not around the sort of function and the legibility that the street signs are. So they sort of do their hiding through a very different kind of logic. But for those people that don't know, so Paddington this is kind of Paddington here in this area. It's about 4 kilometres from modern day Circular Quay. So if anyone's been to Sydney, Circular Quay is up there, and that's the Opera House, just on that little point there, which I guess if you've been there as a tourist, you've probably been there. Or Sydney Cove, as it was named in 1788 by Captain Arthur Phillip, or Warran to give its Aboriginal name. The suburb's northernmost tip ends at now what we call Rushcutters Bay, which is kind of this little bit here. So that sits on the edge of the harbour, and this and the surrounding area was used by the Gadigal people for fishing, hunting and gathering. And you probably know, but just in case you don't, the settler colonial project kind of used the principle of terra nullius, land that's kind of said to belong to no one, to claim what we now call Australia as their own. And then essentially in the process of white possession, they systematically dispossessed, murdered, raped, and incarcerated the original owners of the land. So that really violent process, and I think much more has come to light about that, with quite a lot of interesting research projects that have documented massacres that have been really hidden from sight over a long time, through looking in detail at colonist diaries and things. Fantastic project online by Newcastle University in Sydney that speaks to that. But so there was that violent process going along, but also the colonists brought disease with them. So in 1789, there was a terrible smallpox epidemic that passed really swiftly through the harbour area. So at that time, it was a very small area. This is obviously now when you can see it's really spreading. So that really devastated the kind of Gadigal people and the population. And I think because of that, sometimes there's a belief that Australian Aboriginal people died out in Sydney or moved out of the city. but the remaining owners of the land were and still are an ongoing presence. But although it was only 4 kilometres from the first settlement, in 1788, Paddington was actually really quite remote and quite inaccessible. It was kind of bushland, sand dunes, swamps, that kind of thing. But Governor Macquarie kind of saw it as having potential to kind of move industry into the area that could start supporting a kind of growing colony, I guess, at the time. So from sort of 1810 onwards, there was starting to be a kind of big process of sort of land grants being approved for people. But until the 1840s, Paddington didn't really establish itself really dramatically. And it was only when the barracks, which are here, and if has anyone ever been on the 3-3 bus to Bondi in Sydney? Yeah, because you'll have gone past that if you've been on the 3-3 bus, but it won't look like that anymore. You can kind of still see we've got a bit of sandy roads and sand dunes there. So, but yeah, when that was built, Paddington started to really become developed as a place because they needed housing for all the people that were going to build the barracks, kind of thing. And then in 1842, there was the beginnings of the subdivision of these big estates that had been given to people. So this subdivision of the Underwood estate was one of the first kind of carvings up of what had been a big area of land with a kind of posh house that was given to somebody who actually wasn't a landed gentry. He was actually originally over there as a convict, so it's kind of quite interesting, these stories. But then it was all carved up into the kind of individual plots, I guess. So that's kind of how Paddington started to develop, I guess. Certainly in between sort of in the late 1800s, it really kind of started to develop apace. So by 1890, there was getting on for 4,000 houses. The suburb was largely middle class at that point and had around 18,000 people, which at the time was 3 times the size of Perth. So it's kind of quite, being in Australia now, it's kind of quite hard to get your head around those kind of things. But although that's kind of important to know, it's not really the history of Sydney or the Paddington's growth that's key, but it's actually the way the suburb and the rest of Australia kind of came into being. So as part of the process of subdivision, they actually had to sort of think about, well, if we've got streets, what are we going to call them, basically? So there's lots been written about the role of urban planning in relation to the success of colonisation. Paddington streets, actually, some of them, these look very ordered here, but a lot of them kind of follow the contours of the land and actually reflect the position of the early land grants. So it's actually been described as a bit of an accidental suburb in that respect. So it's not fully planned. But there's, I guess, that idea of an accidental suburb. There's no kind of accident, I guess, about the sort of process of claiming the land and dispossessing the indigenous people of the land through this kind of idea of surveying and carving things up and kind of building. And I think this spatial and material possession is also further supported by the practice of naming, which used the English language. And this is a quote from Paul Carter, who wrote a very famous book called The Road to Botany Bay. It's used to civilize the landscape and bring it into orderly being, kind of thing. But naming isn't just about order. It's not just a functional thing. It's also about the erasure of an indigenous presence and an overwriting of place through kind of official means. So in this context, the naming kind of results in the processes of kind of conquest, cleansing, and founding. But because we're surrounded by place and street names, that plays such a functional role in our everyday lives, we rarely consider the fact that these are material representations of power. So these are some of the great and good, all white men, obviously, that some of the street names in Paddington are named after. So we've got people who were Governor General of Australia. They're coming over as the Earl of Hopetoun and the Earl of Belmore and the Earl of Dudley, whatever. But anyway, the actually, I've gone wrong somewhere. I think I've gone too far. But anyway, I don't know quite where I am with the slides now. The street names in Paddington, basically, I kind of literally walked up and down every single one of them, cross-referenced them with Google Maps. And I think there's 168 streets, lanes, roads, avenues, that kind of thing, 128 distinct names. And I kind of, by kind of cross-referencing with various online sources and databases, I've been able to kind of identify the source of about 120 of those names. And there's about 80 of them that have been given the name of person. So a lot relate to royalty, Windsor, Queen, Victoria, Albert, Regent, that kind of thing. Further 5 have got names after people with titles, so the Earls of Hopetoun and Dudley. Both of those were Governor General of Australia. And lots of other people who played a kind of significant role in the administration of the colony. So both at kind of national level, but also more local level. So there was another sort of 69 of people that names that were about suburb, city and national level in relation to kind of politics and stuff. There's also some streets that are named in connection with the exploration or ownership of land. So some of the people who were given land grants originally have streets named after them. And Matthew Flinders on the bottom right is a very famous kind of explorer within Australia. So what's interesting though about Australia, and I kind of sort of hinted at it there, some of those who ended up owning and residing in these gentry estates actually arrived on Australian shores as convicts. So there wasn't prisons as we know them then, they kind of were just put to work. And then the largest land grant in the area was actually made to James Underwood, Robert Cooper and Francis Forbes. So they'd all been transported to Australia as convicts, and they set up a distillery in Paddington. So this is Robert Cooper here. You can see what naughty things he did. Something, you know, receiving stolen goods, 10 bales of silk and 2 cases of ostrich feathers. So he was shipped over in 1814. He was originally sentenced to 14 years, but actually by 1818, he'd received a conditional pardon. So he's got a street named after him in Paddington, and this is his house that he lived in, which is probably about 5 minutes up the road from where I live. Originally called Ormond House, but he bought it off someone and renamed it Juniper House because of obviously his being involved in the distillery. So I guess in Paddington, perhaps unsurprisingly, the history behind all the identifiable street names is this predominantly white male British settler colonial context. You know, the commemoration of male councillors, politicians, wealthy landowners, you know, reinforces this idea of a process being rooted in power and control. Those who are commemorated are powerful and are able to either take part in the decision-making process of who is commemorated or indirectly influence it. So that obviously corroborates existing kind of critical toponymy studies in relation to how street names illustrate spatial representation of gender, class, race, and perpetuate political cultural order. So in a way, there's kind of nothing new there apart from the Paddington specific context. But I want to think a bit more about the design of the street signs themselves, because we're surrounded by this type of signage and it plays a really functional role in our lives. We rarely consider them sort of material representations of power. And I think that's partly because the design of these really foregrounds their function. You know, it's all about readability from distance, specific typefaces chosen for their clarity. So the street names in Paddington use Univers, which is a neo-grotesque sans serif face designed by Adrian Frutiger in 1957. And I guess it's sort of characterized by this sort of modernist drive to strip everything of decorative elements and sort of really focus on that idea of a rational form that can communicate without any kind of bias in conveying information. So there's this idea of such fonts like Helvetica and whatever as being neutral, but obviously design writer Robin Kim Ross has kind of challenged this as a rhetoric of neutrality several decades ago. But I think there's no doubt in the context of street signs, this sort of systematic approach, the sans serif ubiquitous, does kind of contribute to its ability to primarily be perceived as a functional thing. And I guess what happens as well, that something that once existed because of a particular moment in history or a particular person becomes a signifier about a place and how to get somewhere, rather than that kind of history and ideology. So the sort of commemorative function ensures that ideological and political contexts and meanings are implicit and legitimized through the signs, but the design actively kind of works to make this invisible. So many of the streets which commemorate local politicians or landowners from the 1800s are now largely forgotten. You know, I doubt there's anyone in Sydney who really knows the kind of meaning of these streets or who the people they're kind of named after. So I kind of feel like they inhabit space in a bit of a ghostly fashion. So you can kind of sense there's something there, but it's kind of really inaccessible in terms of the sort of specifics of it. So there's this kind of sort of connotative shift within the street names from their original commemorative function to their kind of more modern day locative function, I guess. So they are definitely kind of hiding in plain sight, I guess. But again, that's not really new ground, I suppose. But as far as I'm aware to date, there's been no focus on house names in relation to the critical toponymy literature. So I think they've really escaped scrutiny. I'm not sure why, because they're definitely right there in our spaces. They're hidden in kind of plain sight again. And they definitely had initially a locative function, because before, certainly in the early 1800s, when a street was built, there wouldn't be a full set of houses. So they would start off with names, and then as the street infilled, houses would get the numbers as well, because they weren't always built from one end to the other, because it depends on what builder had bought what plot of land or whatever. So they're kind of playing both a locative function, but in a lot of cases, they also have a kind of commemorative function. And obviously when numbers kind of really came in, the street was filled, they retained that kind of commemorative function, I suppose. So it's sort of almost diametrically opposed to the process the street names go to. They're obviously commemorative in the first place, and they shift to locative, but then these lose their kind of locative function and just become about what the house is called. You know, you don't actually say, oh yeah, come to my house, I live on Warwick on Cascade Street, because people are like, what do you mean? Like, give me a number, give me a postcode, whatever. Anyway, this was where kind of my COVID walking really came into being. So I literally walked up and down every single street and noted down the street house names in a little notebook. And there were 315 of them in Paddington. So I did do some photography, but unfortunately I've left a lot of that in Sydney. So you're working off some things I had on my phone, so apologies for that. But basically, most of the houses in Paddington are Victorian. So many have a sort of transom window across the door, which is like this example, sort of top left, that is often uses stained glass or etched glass, or sometimes painted. Many of the larger houses feature kind of decorative architectural lettering. They have sort of big parapets that maybe have a name featured on there. And I guess it was these kind of decorative elements were a real feature of that Victorian architecture in that time. I suppose this idea of kind of this unwavering faith in the empire, a kind of pride in material progress, and a sort of, I guess, a desire to display your wealth in terms of how you could decorate your house and give it a kind of fancy name and all the rest of it. So there were three main styles in Paddington. There was the leaded, painted or etched glass in the transom window. There was stuff rendered in plasterwork high on the parapet or on the front wall. There was then a small sign positioned somewhere would be the third one. There was a couple of outliers to that. So the sign would sometimes be on the door in Brixham's case, or more usually to the sort of side of the door. So in terms of the house names, it was actually possible to identify around about half of them of having the original name from the late 1800s or early 1900s. So there's a lot of things called the Sands Postal Directory that I could trawl through. So you can see Stafford Street here. So this is what I mean about sometimes there'd be numbers at some point, but other times, because the house hadn't been fully completed, there would be lots of names listed as well. So trawling through lots of those and searching for references to house names in Trove, which is a really great newspaper database in Australia. I could kind of find lots of examples. So that doesn't necessarily mean the other 173 are not original, because as the suburb got more developed, the need for house names wasn't, as for a locative sort of perspective, wasn't necessary. So as you go further through the Sands directory, the house names are not included, the numbers are included. But I think ultimately, I've got about 239 names that were categorized and about 77 that remain impossible to kind of define, really, because I just don't know what the word means or whether it refers to a place or whatever. I can't find any kind of reference to it, even just by Googling. But it's interesting. So 110 of them, of the 239, refer to places beyond Australia. Unsurprisingly, 76 of those refer to places in what was then Victorian Britain. 44 of those 76 reflect places in England, like the length and breadth of the country. 18 reflect Scottish place names. So we've got Islay there on the left in the middle. We've got 10 reflecting Irish place names, and I haven't got a picture of it, but there's certainly one that's called Derry House. So if you think about today's borders, there's I suppose, an indication there that about potentially Irish nationalist leanings of that person by choosing to say Derry rather than Londonderry, which is kind of interesting. We've got 4 Welsh ones. We've got 4 houses that reflect British palaces and royal residences. We've got a Sandringham, a Windsor, a Balmoral, and a Glamis. And then quite a lot of non-Australian names. So there's a few Italians. So there's a little row where there's Como, Milan, and Turin. But there's kind of New Zealand has got 6, France and Portugal have got 3 each, Greece, Germany, USA have got 2, a Durban one there for you, Everard and Yolandi. But we've also got a lot of Australian place names. And these can be separated into 2 clear sections. So 5 names don't reflect places anywhere else in the world and don't reflect Indigenous place names, right? But a further 25 names take their places from those that are believed to have been named by the settlers using Aboriginal words. And a further 5 use Aboriginal words that are not place names at all. And what was interesting when I started to research this, that in the early 1900s, there were a series of toponymic reference books published in Australia. And the first of those contained about 300 place names. And it was so popular that 3 editions were published and over 7,000 copies were sold, right? And this is an image of the 1952 edition, which was expanded to include 1,500 words, so 700 place names, but also 600 words that he called euphonious words. So they were listed kind of with their meanings. So you can see here, Taralba means place where edible bush grows. And they were mapped in relation to a particular tribe and territory. But the suggested usage for these words included the naming of houses, streets, reserves, clubs, boats, commercial projects, and the like. So it's kind of essentially commodifying and trivializing the indigenous words, positioning them as this kind of asset for the settlers to use to kind of give credibility to the new nation. And there's a writer called Sam Furphy who's sort of talked about the use of language in relation to the colonial project. And he talks about this idea of it glossing over the realities of the violent dispossession of the land. But I think what's interesting here as well is in indigenous culture, place names are seen to be assigned by dreamings to a very specific place, and they can't be uprooted and taken and used elsewhere. So the fact that the settlers not only repurpose Aboriginal place names, but also transplant and repurpose their own place names from Britain, kind of positions them as the real weird kind of place name nomads in this context. So they're shifting from place to place and taking names with them that kind of belong somewhere else, and then they move with them, kind of thing. But I guess what was happening here was this, particularly the use of indigenous words and place names, was ultimately kind of used to sort of establish a sense of history and possession. And these books in particular are sort of part of a further strategy of kind of legitimizing settler colonial control and an ownership of country through the appropriation of indigenous culture. So they're kind of trying to root it in the indigenous culture and give it credibility, but obviously just appropriating that. So there's a house name in particular that really brings that together quite clearly. So the house on the right, which is called Cooey. So Cooey is a kind of really loud extended call used to attract attention or find someone out of sight. So it's like Cooey, kind of like that. Let's see, that's a really bad example. You could probably do it much better than me. It's a bit more high pitched. But anyway, the call was adopted by the settlers. It was noted in, I think, a settler's notebook in 1789, and it comes from the Darug language. But by the 1820s, it had really become part of colonial speech. And in the 1840s, when people were going back to London, it started to be used there. So it started to become this nationalistic word. It became associated with what Australia was. And then in Federation in 1901, the word was kind of embraced as representing Australia as a whole, I guess. There were calls for 3 cheers to be replaced by 3 cooeys. There was a march in 1915 where the Cooey March, 26 people kind of marched from northwest New South Wales, 320 miles to Sydney, recruiting kind of men from towns along the way to fight in World War One. And it was called the Cooey March because every time they got to a town, they let out the kind of Cooey call. So it's not just a case of appropriation, this one. It's also part of a process of what Furphy calls the indigenisation of Australia's settler identity. So, and a key strategy in this process was to use Aboriginal words and place names to create kind of original sounding names that would sort of symbolise a sort of essential Australianness kind of thing. So the use of Aboriginal names by the settlers results in their transformation from Indigenous in origin to Anglo-Australian in nature. And there's now thought to be over around 250 different languages, Indigenous language in Australia, possibly up to 500. So this not only alters a word's meaning permanently, it also results in the hundreds of Aboriginal languages being distilled into kind of one uniform Aboriginal identity. So again, it kind of further contributes to that erasure of Indigenous culture. I kind of think house names might have possibly escaped scrutiny because house naming isn't the province of a local governing body. It's usually an individual personal decision. And it's potentially also because there are just too many of them to contend with, right? I spent a lot of time noting those house names down. But I think also that the answer lies in design, but in a really different way to the street names. So, we've talked about street names being taken for granted and escaping sort of scrutiny in everyday life and hiding in plain sight because of their located function and their design. So with that emphasis of functionality. But in Paddington, the house names, I guess, are designed to kind of emphasize their visual and decorative form. The stained glass uses a wide range of colours, decorative typography. The etched glass has, often has beautiful flourishes. The painted glass has got the gold leaf and the contrasting drop shadow often. And the architectural lettering is, very proudly sort of displayed on the top of parapet and often has lots of decorative features around it. So there's a real kind of sense that the visual and material aspects of the graphic in graphic heritage are really foregrounded here, along with the kind of craft and execution. And that's like really absent, I guess, in the street names in that overt way. But I would kind of argue that this overemphasis on design and aesthetics and materiality that makes them kind of clearly visible in the urban environment has been kind of resulted in them, I guess, just being read simply as part of this authentic Victorian heritage architecture within Paddington. And so their sort of role in this settler colonial project, that in part is about overwriting and taking of place, remains kind of hidden. So, but unlike the street names where they're hidden because of their functionality, it's almost like the beauty that obscures their role. They kind of take their place and play their part in the way the built heritage of the white left settlers has come to be celebrated. And they're seen as what Australian academic Wendy Shaw calls desirable remnants of the colonial past. So their ability to foreground the aesthetic highlights an inability to connect this built heritage with the process and practice of settler colonialism. So it's almost like a process of disavowal. We kind of see the material evidence of the settler colonial project in front of us, but we don't really acknowledge it. So this focus on aesthetics also suggests a kind of romanticising of the signs. Particularly in winter at the moment, the stained glass windows in the evening, they cast this kind of really warm glow when the light's on in the hallway. And you almost get a kind of triggering of a sort of effective response that's all about, you kind of see them and you think, you sort of imagine the warmth inside of the home and the family and this kind of idea of belonging and, this kind of like sense of maybe your own home in the past, and then it kind of, I guess, takes you back to the sort of home of the original settlers. And I think there's a lot written about the connection between ruins and romanticisation, change and traces of change in everyday sort of spaces, and this idea of ghosts in the past encountered in the present. And I'm not saying these houses in Paddington ruins; they're absolutely not there. They're gentrified up to the max, kind of thing. But I think the use of the traditionally crafted house names and the architecture more generally reflect a particular time that comes with a sense of age. And I think with age kind of often comes a sort of misty-eyed nostalgic affection that this kind of provokes, I guess. And I think this temporal dimension operates in a particular and quite selective way. It kind of shuttles between our experience of heritage in the present and then in the Victorian era in which Paddington was developed. And for those whose family migrated to Australia, and specifically those who came in the Victorian period, this inevitably encompasses an imaginative journey that foregrounds those who've arrived as part of the settler colonial project. So by extension, this negates any reference to the Indigenous owners of the land and the process of invasion. So the seemingly distant past of 100 or 150 years ago that you look at in these photos is a kind of mere moment in the 65,000 years or more that Indigenous people have lived in Australia. So the way link between these examples of graphic heritage and the settler colonial development of Sydney kind of probably further enables a belief that Aboriginal heritage or traditions are pre-colonial and therefore kind of almost prehistoric. So this kind of process of denial effectively leads to the production of what Glenn Coulthard calls an urbs nullius. So not a terra nullius, but an urbs nullius. So this is the idea of urban space that's perceived as empty of Indigenous people, but somehow separate to country. And that's country with a capital C. So urban country could never actually not be anything but country, because in an Aboriginal context, country is not a particular place or environment. It's not the bush kind of thing. It's everywhere. And countries are like a living entity that encompasses all land, all water, all humans, more than humans, all the tangible and intangible. So you can't, it's kind of it doesn't kind of work in that respect. And also, I mean, it's an area I didn't get into. You can't own country. So actually, this process of subdivision and naming, and my house is called this, goes completely against the idea of country. But there's also a multi-locational aspect to both the street and house names that reflect places outside of Australia. Names like Ascot or Milan overwrite a single Australian place with a multitude of towns and cities across other countries. So when I was walking around, it almost felt like I was in some weird situationist derive, where I was kind of walking in a place that was Australian, but I had a map that kind of was taking me across the world kind of thing. But I guess, although it sort of suggests that you could have this really derive-like experience, I think what happens in Paddington is the fact the names are from largely colonial times. They reinforce the settler colonial project rather than challenge it. You know, derive and the situationists were all about challenging space, but I think here it kind of reinforces that really. And I think, you know, the majority of street names lose their meaning over time, but the geographical place names, I guess, retain their relevance because they're still in use today. We still know what Ascot is if we're English, but we probably don't know who Mr. Vialou was, who was an alderman in Sydney, that named a street. So there's this really continuing presencing of the settler colonial project, even though it's rarely noticed. And I think in Paddington, there's God, I'm rubbish at timing again. Look.
You're fine.
In Paddington, there's a doubling of dispossession at play, one in which the graphic heritage of the house names plays a critical role. So in using names of places from outside Australia and in using Aboriginal words to overwrite place, we've seen that this results in multiple ways in which the settler colonial project is simultaneously masked and reinforced. So while Indigenous culture is consigned to kind of prehistory and absent in the contemporary urban world, but the house names that retain the original design and beautifully crafted add to this process in a further material way. So the origins of house naming functioned in the same way as a coat of arms, albeit at a humbler level, a kind of signifier of rank, I guess. So the house names don't just evidence ownership, but they're also a kind of statement of power. You know, if you had the money to put something like this on the top of your house, it kind of acts as that sort of Borgesian idea of symbolic capital. And property, and by extension, by ownership, is one way in which settler colonialism persists and continues to create its spaces in the present. So unless a settler colonial city is being analysed from this perspective, the traces of that remain hidden and the continued impact of both power and place is similarly obscured. So you kind of reinforce this idea of urbs nullius. And in Paddington today, the process of gentrification has kind of reached extreme proportions. So a relatively small two-bedroom terrace house that sold for $42,000 in 1985 sold at auction for $3 million in 2025. And the selling agent stated the guide price of 2.6 million was pretty entry level for a terrace in Paddington. Right. And so a lot of the real estate rhetoric kind of leans into this kind of narrative that really foregrounds this Victorian heritage, a rare double-fronted 1880 residence, flawlessly renovated to balance the heritage character with modern glamour. And so I think the original kind of house names with their beautiful design kind of contribute to this heritage-led desirability. And this kind of idea of authenticity within the suburb. So this in turn kind of continues to drive the sort of processes and change of development even further to what Loretta Lees kind of calls super gentrification levels. So in Paddington, the role of property and property ownership is a sort of continued, as a sort of continued process of settler colonial dispossession, I think is really clearly apparent. So I guess coming back to the Brixham sign, for me, that first triggered sort of nostalgic memories of family holiday in Devon. But actually, when I think about those, they were probably not very true memories anyway. They were kind of imagined. I imagined this lovely family holiday, but I think my mum hated being in a caravan. She hated the beach. It was probably a disaster, but I can only remember the nice bits. But it kind of transported to me that time and space. And I think along with many of the other original examples of house names in Paddington, Brixton plays its part in kind of creating these beautiful heritage streetscapes that are now really protected as part of heritage conservation work in the area. And I really appreciated that sign for its aesthetic value and the use of craft and that visual kind of language that was rooted in a very particular moment of design history. But I guess when I started to look into this more deeply and when I started to write the chapter, those nostalgic kind of romanticized memories and this focus on design and heritage have been kind of tempered and challenged by a greater understanding of the processes and practices of violent settler colonial dispossession that began in 1788. So both the street signs and the house name signs are complicit in that project, and they both seek to kind of overwrite and take space. And the settler colonial process project and process of dispossession is not a historical event. It continues to unfold in the present in a myriad of different ways. So, while it's super beautiful and it adds to this idea of a beautiful heritage area, it continues to do that work of the settler colonial projects. And I think for me, certainly once I've revealed that or understood that connection, it then actually becomes really difficult to unsee. Sorry, that's very dark and bleak, isn't it?
Thank you for listening to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies. A quick reminder about how to stay connected. You can find us on Blue Sky, LinkedIn and Instagram, and you can also watch the presentations on YouTube. The podcast is available on all the major platforms. Please download, share, and most importantly, subscribe. See you next time.